Welcome, my friend, to the On the Blue Line podcast for law enforcement. I am your host, Wayne Mulder. This is the podcast that helps law enforcement officers overcome the mental health toll of the profession to become better leaders and protectors on and off the job. This week in the interview room, I sit down with guest John O'Brien. He's the founder of ActivateSuccess.org. Another episode of the On the Blue Line podcast starts now. If you break the law, if you decide to do this, we're going to hold you responsible.
You are the only good thing in someone's worst day. That is a privilege for a police officer.
At the very least, you could honor the sacrifices of police officers and their families.
We have the ability to save the Republic. And that's right, things are going to get better. I love the intro song. So if you're not following us on Twitter or X formerly known as Twitter, or whatever you want to call that platform, join us at On the Blue Line and the number 1, at On the Blue Line and the number 1. That is the social media that I am most active on. Other than that, everywhere else we're at On the Blue Line podcast, but I am less active on all of those. And if you're enjoying the content, especially if you're enjoying the content, please be sure to leave us a rating and review if you're on iTunes or on one of their platforms that allow you to do that. And then anytime you share this content and just help get the word out there, it's a huge help. As you know, there are so many podcasts these days that you just kind of get lost in the noise. And anything you can do if you're enjoying the content to help get it out to more people will help ensure that this will be around for a length of time. Well, without taking any more time, let me tell you a little bit about this week's guest. He's a PhD level trained counseling psychologist who's been working with counseling individuals and teaching students since 1996. He's worked as a therapist and specialized in treatment of substance abuse, grief, and trauma. He's an adjunct faculty member at the University of Maine at Augusta and is teaching courses in psychology and addiction since 2000. In addition, he provides coaching and consulting to businesses around executive assessment, leadership development, and health and wellness through his business Activate Success. And as you can imagine, all those topics are very applicable to exactly what we do in law enforcement. That's why once I learned about what he was doing, I wanted to have him on because you're only going to benefit from this conversation. He's got, as you heard, lots and lots of experience, but in his many years as a teacher, he's become skilled at explaining complex psychological constructs, or AKA psychobabble, into something that is clearly understood, and the concepts are done in a way that only a teacher or someone with the heart of a teacher can do. You're going to enjoy this podcast because it's a lot of things that we've discussed before, from stress, self-care, flow, intentionality, mindfulness, but even things like post-traumatic growth. We always hear post-traumatic stress disorder, but we even talk about what is post-traumatic growth and what does that mean for us in the law enforcement career. So you're going to enjoy this without taking any more time. Here's this week's guest, John O'Brien. Well, John, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Wayne. It's a pleasure to be here.
It has taken us a little bit of time to finally get this together, but I'm so thankful it did.
Yes, well, persistence pays off, as I always like to say, and that was true for our conversation and the planning here.
Absolutely. And like with everything we'll discuss today, sometimes you just got to push through the obstacles. So maybe we're starting with the best information we can give the listener.
Absolutely. We have a real world example of how persistence pays off that we're able to have this conversation, right? After 5 months of planning.
That's right. So there you go. For the listeners, that's the secret. Well, yes. John, let me start with you as I do with everybody.
Okay.
Coffee or tea?
Oh, coffee, hands down.
Now, black coffee, or do we have to do some tweaking to it, or what kind of coffee?
We got some tweaking. We got some tweaking for sure, as far as coffee is concerned, not tweaking of another kind.
I guess we have to be clear with the conversation.
All right. So, yes, we are like cream, a little cream, great cup of coffee, not your average coffee like, Starbucks or some sort of, higher end coffee, but unfortunately limited to 2 cups of caffeinated coffee per day.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. As much as I love talking about coffee and thinking of coffee, I have to limit myself as well.
Yes, indeed. Well, and that this is a foreshadowing of one of the things we may talk about for the benefit of your listeners.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to that. But let me back up and ask then, where is your favorite place to have that drink?
Favorite place? I think usually on the deck at my mom's house, which is, we're fortunate that she bought a home years ago with my dad on the water. It was a
Okay.
little cottage that they've added on to. So now when I go to visit mom and, do my time of having to visit mom, I have to suffer and sit on the deck right by the ocean and enjoy a cup of coffee. So I'd say that's my favorite place.
That's absolutely wonderful. Obviously not specific area, but what part of the country are we talking?
The Northeast.
Okay,
Yep,
very
I'm
nice.
up in Maine, so that's where I inhabit.
So that is some absolutely beautiful country. I've had a chance to spend a little time outside Bangor at a lake property. So absolutely beautiful.
And I'm glad to hear that you pronounced that correctly, because sometimes people say Bangor, Maine. It's like, no, Bangor, and you did it perfectly, Wayne. So look at that. You are an experienced Mainer. It's clear.
Thank you. I don't know if we're quite that far being a boy from Indiana stuck in Florida, but I appreciate that. So let me ask you, John, do you have a best or worst travel story?
I'll go for, well, of course I have both, but I'm going to stick with best, which would you like me to go beyond that or just say that I have a best one?
Well, if you have a best one, we would love to hear it.
Aha. Okay. Well, I would say that I had the opportunity to do my dream vacation of motorcycling in the Alps.
Wow.
And I've always enjoyed motorcycling. I had my share of scares and whatever else on it, but had the opportunity to go to Europe, meet a friend over there, and ride a Harley through the Alps. It was absolutely amazing.
That is wonderful. And probably one of the best answers I've had to that question. That is absolutely amazing. And as one who also enjoys motorcycles, I can just imagine how beautiful that was. So
yeah, I mean, it was the old roads, which were very twisty and turny. So there was enjoyment and kind of terror all mixed together. But that's part of what made it a good vacation.
Yes. I think just in the opening to the show, we have given like 3 major life lessons. So
yes, indeed.
Hopefully the listeners are paying attention to this.
We're on a roll. Let's keep going, right?
Do you have a favorite modern nonfiction book? So a nonfiction book, but one that's newer.
Ooh, let's say nonfiction. So, well, is it okay if it's a theoretical book?
Absolutely.
Is that all right with you? Okay, so I'm interested in neuroscience and the impact that neuroscience has on us and on our functioning. So there's a book that's I think it was by David Rock, I believe, called "It's Coaching with the Brain in Mind," and that's one of the areas that in which I practice is doing coaching of leaders. And so I've been always interested in the impact that neuroscience has on us and on leadership, and so that's one of my favorite books.
Very good. I will look that up, and I'll also be sure to link it up just in case any listeners are wanting to check that out as well.
Yeah.
So similar to the coffee question, but a little bit different tweak to it. Where is that place that brings you the most peace? That place you go to just kind of stop, breathe, and enjoy life?
Well, I mean, and we may end up talking about this, but sometimes when people get into what are called states of flow, which is where they're very much really very mindful and relaxed, I would have to say for me, one of those places is when I'm out on a motorcycle ride. Usually once a week on Sundays, I take off and just ride for a few hours out west of the city of Portland here and just go out to the country and just have a chance to just kind of relax, even though I have to be kind of alert at the same moment. You're very, very present, and it's also very peaceful. So
that's amazing. And a great answer. And I can just think of motorcycles and Maine, and I'm thinking of moose, but that's a different conversation.
That's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Yes. Right.
But to that point, it's funny how many guys that are real big into like Brazilian jiu-jitsu and those kind of fighting, they'll answer that question with their time on the mat is one of the places they kind of stop, breathe, and enjoy life because it has both of the elements you just referenced.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let's just kind of introduce you to the audience. So start as far back as you want, kind of your story and what kind of led you, maybe your origin story and what led you to what you're doing now.
Okay. Well, I'm born and originally raised in Massachusetts. I've always been from the Northeast, and so was in elementary and half of high school in Massachusetts, and then we moved to Maine when I was in the middle of high school, and that's part of an important inflection point in my story. But I'll go on to say that I finished my undergraduate and master's at Boston College and Tufts University, and worked as a high school guidance counselor for 2 years. So I was just a few years older than the students, as Mr. O'Brien, the guidance counselor, and then went back to, as I like to call it, graduate school, to get my doctorate at
That's well
Michigan
said.
State, right? So I hit the Midwest for 4 years. And then in finishing my doctorate, we have to do an internship placement. So I went to Texas, where I was in the Dallas area at the VA to finish my doctoral placement, where I learned important things like how to say y'all, all y'all, and fixin' to, and other important Southernisms. And then moved back to Maine, where I've been practicing since 1996.
Wow. That is amazing. And you're still teaching and so forth as well, right? Are you still adjunct faculty and so forth?
Yes, I've been adjunct faculty at UMaine Augusta for just finishing my 23rd year. I just finished that. I've been a clinician in doing private practice psychotherapy for 25 years. I started when I was 3. That's why it's been that many years. I'm not really that old. No, maybe I am. And then also I've recently been interested in the overlap between psychology and the business world and applying it specifically to leadership. And that's why I've gotten trained as a coach. And so I have a business that's really the primary emphasis of my work these days, called Activate Success, wherein I do professional speaking and leadership coaching with a specific emphasis on stress management. And if I may, I'll just allude back to what I said about that inflection point, because that's really an important part of my story.
Yeah.
Which is that when I was 15, my dad, who was an executive himself, had a really serious heart attack and almost died. I was the one with him at the time of the heart attack, but it was one of those. So it was one of those kind of quiet, quiet heart attacks. But we knew he had to get some medical attention. So he was never able to work again after that and died young at the age of 63. Unfortunately, his lack of self-care was something that I saw, and was certainly part of my motivation to go into the field of psychology. And it's no surprise now that I've circled over, having worked with many people in a variety of fields, but now circling over to try to work with leaders like my dad to hopefully help them be able to manage their stress more effectively than he did.
Yeah, that is amazing. And when I first was looking over some of the stuff you were talking about, and or on your website and so forth, prior to us talking about it, it was an interesting to me how when you talk about leaders in this business community, guys like your dad who they have these high level positions or so forth in these businesses, and the crossover to that and what we do in the law enforcement environment or in the military environment. Just real quick for the listeners, hopefully you're all listening to the end of this episode and you can get the show notes below, but it's activatesuccess.org, I believe.
.org, correct.
And we'll be giving that again at the end. And I hope you're sticking with us. Let's we can go a couple different directions there, but I'd first be curious, since I think one of the common denominators between the two is stress.
Absolutely.
What is that kind of, we all know what stress is, right? Like even before we were talking here, we were talking about the 15 things I'm trying to juggle. And listeners, please don't do as I do as I say.
Exactly.
But we all do that, right, John?
Absolutely, yeah.
So what does this look like? Like you as, what does this look like? And then kind of take us from there.
Okay. Well, what I would say is that many people think of stress as distress, as difficult, painful, overwhelming, negative things, which certainly that stress, conflicts with a colleague or with a life partner, stresses in the work environment. So there's a lot of stress that comes from those sources, but there's also something called eustress, like euphoria, EU, that those are positive things, like you may have mentioned that you just, if I may say this, just bought a house,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
So buying a house, or when people get married or welcome a child, that these are positive things. But embedded in that positive thing can be a lot of difficulties. And sometimes even a positive thing um, ends up in the longer term having its own difficulties, as in kind of relationships, or certainly sometimes buying a house these days especially is not so simple, right?
Exactly. Very true.
So it's supposedly something that's very joyful, but when you are competing with a billion other people to get this one house and putting in offers and getting rejected, there's a lot of difficulty in that. So people tend to underestimate, I think, the impacts that even positive things can have on their lives. Because if we look at the actual definition of stress, it's our reaction to any change in our lives.
Okay.
So we are creatures of habit. We like things a certain way. And that when we go outside what is the normal routine, that's a stressor. And we're going to have a reaction to that.
Yes. And so taking that one step further, because when I think of like law enforcement, obviously I do a lot of what I do because I look at introspectively, right?
Yeah.
I look at myself and
Right.
what I'm going through. And I think it's true in the business world too, because prior to law enforcement, I put plants in the ground green side up. I was a landscaper for years, ran a landscape
Ah,
company.
uh-huh.
So I am familiar with that. Some of the business stress, not a high level executive stress, but you're still making payroll every Friday, which is stress.
Yes, absolutely.
So my question would be, in the law enforcement environment, there's obviously stress that's intrinsic to the job, right? There's what we deal with out there in society, the type of call you may go to, the unknown of it, the radio. And then you have stress that comes from above, which is something I talk about a lot about on here. Because honestly, when I talk to law enforcement officers, it isn't so much the stress of someone shooting at them that bothers them. It's the stress of what administration requires and those kind of internal stresses to the agency.
Mm-hmm.
And then where I would form it into a question is, so you have the stress of the job, you have the internal, if you would, to the agency stress, but then you have these life stresses. Is this then compounding? Like, is this kind of like a tidal wave? Because one thing that I notice is some people are like, it's when things aren't as crazy that all of a sudden you kind of see that damn break, if you would. That's when all of a sudden the reality of all this stress that's built up over the years kind of hits them. Is that an accurate picture?
Well, and it's interesting. You're kind of weaving in, I think, a few things here, which, if I may, sort of two things I hear
Please.
is the kind of stress response and what happens in the stress response. I can talk a little bit about that, but I think the other thing that you're talking about too is the accumulation of stressors over time, and let me just talk about that for a minute, because I think you're onto something that if it can all pile up,
Okay.
and that maybe people have a very challenging position in law enforcement, or maybe a difficult beat that they have to work, or difficult supervisees they're dealing with, but their home life is stable. And so they always know that they come back to that. And despite the fact that that work environment's really stressful, they know they can go back to that. Or maybe they have a difficult time in their home life at present. But in fact, the work environment, while challenging, they have good collegial relationships, and they have good relationship with the people in their neighborhood that they work. So it's not as their actual source of their stress is more their home life. I think the problem is when either it's in the work life or in the home life, or a combination of those, stressors build up to a certain level that, as you said just now, the dam breaks.
Yeah.
It's like, even just, and sometimes it's that people are not practicing very effective stress management skills, but even
Which
for
is
those
where I'm
people who
going
are.
with all this. That's the road I want to end up on.
Right. Okay. So yeah, we're heading there. We're on the
Okay.
same route. I knew we would be. Um, that sometimes the thing is, sometimes people are practicing the right things. I was talking to someone this morning who is doing all the right things, but what we talked about, the fact is sometimes even the most skilled people practicing all those self-care things that we talk about, the environment is just too stressful. Like even practicing everything people need to, sometimes stress is just too much, and it does then start to affect them. And so then they have to figure out, do I need to change my job? Do I need to change my approach to the job? Do I need to take time off for a bit? Like what drastic measures perhaps do I need to take? So
Right.
even the most skilled people can be affected by stress.
No, that makes perfect sense. If you don't mind, this may be a good place to kind of talk. Is there like one or two? I'm sure there's many, but is there one or two things that we can offer on the conversation of stress to kind of, because I guess here's what goes through my mind when I hear this, right? Because you, especially nowadays, which is great, there's a lot of content and a lot of information out there around these issues. And there's a lot of information around the negative side of it, like where this leads to ultimately, right? So it's a lot of things on that literally save lives, because you have suicide, like long end, what happens if this is never addressed and so forth. So either major health issues like you described, or you get into things as like suicide, which is kind of how this podcast got started when we lost a fellow deputy. So when I started in 2019, I lost a fellow deputy a month later in the district that I was working in. So that kind of became a why to, and since that time, our agency, which is a mid-size agency, but we've since lost another deputy. So I've seen the end results of what happens with unchecked, unmitigated there. So I'm going to lead to a different question, but just backing up to what are just one or two of those things that we can start with throwing out to them, and obviously we'll refer them to some areas they can go from there.
Well, one immediate thing that comes to mind is that people need to know for themselves what are their signs of stress. Like, because I can lecture all day about things to like get chronic headaches, muscle tension, stomach aches, feeling like a sense, maybe some level of panic or anxiety, maybe falling into starting to recognize people are using alcohol too much. Like it's important people know what are their own personal signs of stress, and is there a progression for them, so that they can identify that, okay, this is a symbol to me, or this is a sign to me that my stress is progressing. As an example, one of the things that I know used to be that I would lock my keys in my car. So
it happens.
Right, it does, right? But now with the wonders of technology, I have one of those magic things that that can never happen, because my keys can't get locked in. But it's when I recognize that okay, I'm like a little bit more accident prone, or I go to leave and it's like, wait a minute, I don't have my computer with me. Back in the house, get my computer, go back out to the car. And then it's like, oh, wait a minute, I don't have my glasses with me. Back in the house. Then it's like, okay, John, stop. Like, this is just, this is you got too much going on. Stop, reflect on what's happening, and I can talk more about that. But so the point here is, know what are the signs you have of stress, and then what their progression is, so that then you also then can get into like, what are the go-tos that you either need to do or do more of. And I would just say that and this is from a colleague, Dana Giunta. This is not, but she'd written a book about stress, and what she said is the number one mistake that people make in regard to stress management is that as they get more stressed, they give up their coping mechanisms because they don't have time for them. They tell themselves, I don't have time to go to the gym. I don't have time to prepare a meal or for healthy meals or whatever. And that then further compounds the situation.
Yeah. No, that actually preaching to the choir on that. I can,
right.
I can definitely see the brilliance of that. One of the things I hear, so there's this whole idea of balanced life, and I know you've talked about things such as that too, and I know that plays a lot in what we're talking about here. But the issue that I often hear when I talk to people and that term balance comes up, there's like, well, if by balance you mean I need to do this, I have kids, I have work, maybe they're active in church or community event, or they've got 400 things on their plate, and they're like, okay, well, you get 3 minutes and 33 seconds, and you get, that's balance. That's also not realistic because that kid wants
Right.
more than 3 minutes and 33 seconds.
Right.
So what does that look like? Is that kind of balance achievable, or what do we mean when we say balance kind of as a starting point for this stress management?
Well, I hear people talk about it, and I'm glad to hear you talk about it as balanced living, as opposed to people talk about work-life balance.
Right.
And that makes it sound like work isn't a part of life. And it's an important part of life. And it's often for people in certain professions. And I think that's true of law enforcement. And it certainly is true in my field in terms of the mental health field and working in psychology. It's a part of our identity. It's not, it's like, the older, what was the army thing? It's not just a job, it's an adventure. Well, I mean, certainly law enforcement work, and I can tell you my job too, it's an adventure sometimes. Um,
Yes.
but it's part of our identity. So, um, I think that the whole concept of balanced living, I don't know that we can come up with like, well, here's the way to do it, like here's the rubric, but rather I think just recognizing you have to. A colleague of mine talked about balanced living like you have to figure out how your life is like an art exhibit, and you can only put so many things in the exhibit in an art museum, and you have to figure out what's the focal piece, what are the other pieces around it, what do you want to contain in your exhibit, and then what do you just not have room for. And maybe there will be times in our lives, and I certainly have had them as well, where it's like there's too much in my exhibit, like it's end of semester, and like it was a few weeks ago, I was at a conference, I'm finishing teaching 3 classes, I'm trying to see a few clients while I'm at this conference who were in crisis. So like there's a lot going on, there's too much going on, but this this is where life's at right now, and I know, but I'm not going to do this forever. Like I'm out of balance, but I have to do this for right now, but then I have to try to get myself back to balance as soon as I can. The point really is that sometimes things just will get out of balance. That's the reality. We can't always be in this perfect balance, but just to know I'm out of balance and I got to give some things up perhaps or reprioritize.
And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of what we're talking about, and it's an often maybe overused word, but it's this whole idea of intentionality. It's this idea
Absolutely.
of living intentionally rather than just kind of going with the flow and whatever will happen will happen. There are moments of that, like our conversation, right? We talked about, this
Absolutely.
conversation was going to be that way, but it's predicated on all sorts of intentionality that came into this moment.
The other word I would throw in there, which I think is an overused word, but is mindfulness, right? Being mindful.
Yes.
There's a lot of stuff out there about mindfulness, and some of which, I think can be quite practical, but people sometimes give mindfulness a bad rap or don't really understand it. Think I'm not doing yoga, so I'm not doing any of that mindfulness stuff. Okay, and I say no, but there are ways to do that quite practically.
I was quite literally going to ask this question next, and I was going to open it with that exact statement.
Oh my word!
I was like, because I have on here mindfulness or awareness, and I wanted to kind of get your idea or your feedback on this idea of mindfulness, because you're right. They instantly go to the yoga studio, or they're thinking we're going to have some bells and maybe some candles are burning, and maybe that's fine. Yeah. Depending on where you are in Maine, that may or may not be, that you might get some weird looks on both sides, but
yes, indeed.
But what does it mean to you when you use that word?
Well, a great definition I learned many years ago in dialectical behavior therapy, which is a form of treatment I do for people that have something called borderline personality disorder. But mindfulness is the awareness of the inner world of thoughts and feelings and the outer world of actions and perceptions. So in any moment, we can focus internally or externally. And depending upon what's going on in that moment, it may make sense to be focused more externally or internally. The other piece I would add, this is a lengthy definition, unfortunately, but the other piece that I would add is that mindfulness is not about being perfectly focused. I was talking to someone about this yesterday. Mindfulness is simply being aware of where is your awareness.
Interesting. So it really isn't even focus at all.
Not necessarily, because, well, it's trying to be bringing your focus to something. And some days that, whether it's to your breath or, your body in space or where you're sitting or to a certain sound, some days you may be pretty able to do that and your mind won't be very busy. But some days your mind may be bopping all around and people are like, well, I'm failing mindfulness today. Or I've heard people say, well, I can never be mindful because my mind's all over the place. And it's like, yeah, but you're noticing the fact that your mind's all over the place, which in fact means you're mindful.
Okay. Now, is it just as simple as, like, is it an internal thing where I just kind of do it? So is it the noticing of it that makes it the mindfulness, or is it some action of, okay, I'm going to concentrate on this, or I'm going, you know what I mean? Is it that kind of intentional focusing, which again, I'm using that word, or is it just really kind of the realization that, hey, all these balls are in the air and I'm realizing they're all in the air? How would you describe that dichotomy, if you would?
Well, I think you have laid that out quite nicely, Wayne. And the fact is, it's both.
Okay.
And now people who are mindfulness purists may be horrified. Hopefully, none of them are listening. They may be horrified at hearing me say this, because some people would say mindfulness is really the process of bringing your focus of attention to a sound, to your thoughts, and kind of in a meditative way,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So mindfulness being the larger category, something like meditation or yoga, or focusing on breathing could be, those are strategies of mindfulness. This is the way that I think about it. But so though there are some that would say that it's a task that you do that is about mindfulness. But there also is the whole concept of just being aware of what you are doing or what's happening for you internally or what's going on externally, that is about being mindful, and it's about, the word you used is awareness, and that's exactly right. So it can be either,
Okay.
in terms of
And
its use.
and when we're talking about task focus, then that could be even things like we talked about early on with the MMA, or some sort of like hitting the mats or being on the motorcycle, or in all of those moments, that could be a task that works well for the individual rather than, say, yoga or whatever's best for them. Is that
Yes,
accurate?
yes, there are different, and the people describe mindfulness in different ways, but there's one type of mindfulness practice that is called participate fully.
Okay.
And that's so that the mindfulness that I have taught people are the what skills and the how skills. What skills are observing, which is, in short, trying to just notice some physical sensation and notice some sensory experience, but have no words in your mind. Like, don't not label like, oh, what's that sound? That sounds like a bird or whatever. No, it's just literally trying to observe and keep your mind blank,
Okay.
which is perhaps it's allegedly the most elementary, and to me the most challenging.
I was going to
Because
say, I find it extremely.
right, I'm a wordy person where I want to like be labeling things. So there's that. Thank goodness the next level is describe mindfulness, where we can use words in our mind to be focused on noticing a sound and noticing what we think of in a non-judgmental way. And then finally, participate fully, which is being fully with an activity, mind and body in an activity. So like your guests who have talked about MMA, or people, whether maybe they're doing yoga, maybe they're running, that, or again, motorcycling or something people relive, where they get into those states of what's called flow, where they're very much with that process. So those are the what skills of mindfulness. And the how skills of mindfulness include trying to do it non-judgmentally, which is about not judging yourself like, see, I can't do this mindfulness stuff. I knew I could never do this This is ridiculous. Or doing a mindfulness task. I was doing one when I was first learning in a group, and we had to do this mindful walking in silence. I felt like I joined a cult when we were doing this. And we're walking along, and I happened to glance ahead, and I saw a colleague of mine who was she looked very focused, and I found myself going, Emily's she's doing this so well. I can't even believe it. I can't do this stuff. She's like perfectly focused. So I was, again, comparing and judging. So non-judgmentally, one mindfully, is noticing when our mind is jumping around different places. Like, you start in one room and you're going to write checks, but then you realize, oh, this pen has run out. I need to go to get a pen in the kitchen. Then you go to the kitchen, then you're in the kitchen and you're going to get a pen, but then you see, oh, there's that pan that's left over from last night. So then you start washing the pan, but then you think, wait a minute, we don't have enough dish soap. So then you're off to the garage to get the supply of dish soap, and on and on. I'll stop there, but you get the idea.
Yes,
That
I'm
can happen
picturing.
behaviorally,
Yeah.
right? Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say you were describing yesterday for me. So anyway, go on.
Right. So we can do that behaviorally, or we can do that in our mind.
Yeah.
So one mindfully is about trying to bring your mind back to like recognize, oh, here I go behaviorally, or here goes my brain mind. It's like a sheepdog. It's like you got to bring your mind, just choose to bring your mind back. Bring your mind back. And the last piece of mindfulness I'll just mention is something that's called effectiveness, doing what works, being effective. So maybe you're trying to do, I'm going to sit and just listen to the birds. And that's what you've decided to do for mindfulness practice. But you do that for like 30 seconds and you're like finding yourself irritated. Well, then rather than like, I got to stick with this because this is what I chose. It's like, no, I'm going to go do some MMA. I'm going to go out for a motorcycle ride. It's like, do what works. And that can be true also interpersonally, which I won't get into, but that's a whole other conversation, that figuring out not what's right, not getting stuck in what's right, but focusing on what's effective.
I love that. I think there's a lot to that. I bring so many people on here with such great information, and I think sometimes it gets overlooked that, and maybe correct me, of course, if I'm wrong, but I think to me, one of the biggest lessons is do something, do what works for you. It's better than doing nothing. It's being like, there's so many options. I'm not going to do anything. That's like the worst decision you can make. The best decision is find the thing that works for you and do that. Start there, whatever that is.
And I would add to that, and do it with whatever frequency and intensity you can. Years ago, I remember getting myself into this mindset about, well, if I can't go to the gym for at least 45 minutes, it's not worth going.
Right.
And now, if I can do a walk for 15 minutes, or if I can do a workout for 30 minutes, or like, don't get caught up in these extremes. Like, just even do a little bit. You can do a 5-minute walk. You can do a 2-minute walk. Like, do whatever you can. Don't get caught up in, it's like all or nothing thinking.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And that's certainly something that I've had to deal with over the years. So that is wonderful. I want to switch gears just a little bit, because we talked a lot about stress. And what I think I want to do is just, there's a million ways we could go, and some of those million ways we'll do next time. But
Okay.
I think that what I'm thinking is, what about trauma? How does trauma and stress differ from each other? Because that's another word that gets used a lot. And again, when I think about the law enforcement career and kind of the analogy I was providing earlier, you have stressors, the things that are, and we have good stress, the stress that you were talking about, and we have the negatives, distress, so forth. But going, how does stress and trauma differ? Because I think sometimes those terms can be used somewhat interchangeably by people like me that don't know what I'm talking about.
Right. Well, and people sometimes use like, oh, stress and trauma, like they just lump them together, right? So I would say stress being the larger category that I mentioned before. We talked about kind of our natural reaction to any change in our lives, and that there's sort of varying levels of stress. Trauma and a traumatic experience being events that occur. The original definition when I first started to practice was that trauma was an event, quote, outside the range of normal human experience.
Okay.
So really at that time, we were thinking simply about combat, right? As that was really the one category that we would think of as something that was a traumatic experience. But now we know that it certainly is about the experience of combat, but there are so many other experiences that are actually, unfortunately, part of everyday life now that can lead people to ultimately have a traumatic experience, which is really any experience in which a person experiences some sort of threat to their personal integrity, threat to their life, or they witness someone else, the threat to someone else's life, or someone else dying or being injured, and that There are a variety of things, certainly combat and sexual assault, abuse, domestic violence, but things like car accidents now have been recognized as a source of trauma. Um, Illness, heart attack, and stroke have been identified now, as a potential source of stress. So it's really these major events that sometimes are a part also of the everyday life and work of people.
Right.
Certainly, people in law enforcement will be called to shootings and domestic violence and murder scenes and all kinds of things where they are then also witnessing the aftermath of that. So I think, unfortunately, law enforcement individuals are really, as we always say, kind of in the line of fire, but also in specifically in terms of encountering trauma at a much greater level than people in other lines of work.
Yes. Yeah, I would certainly concur with that. Um, so trauma, how does it I guess two sides of it, because one is kind of the positive, like what do we do? Because these incidents are very much part of law enforcement, right? Like for
Yes.
instance, just take death alone. Anyone that passes away within the county who is not either under hospice care or in a hospital, law enforcement is going to it. So just in general, law enforcement sees a lot of death in the span of their career than most people do in the civilian population. It's just a fact of the nature of it. And that's aside from traumatic deaths, your suicides and so forth that are obviously a part of what they go to. So in my opinion, or in my thinking, there would be some level of compounding, like I was talking about earlier, that kind of happens over the years. So I guess my two questions here is, first of all, are there things we can be doing from like a self-care that kind of helps from these things leading to other negative effects? And then how do these negative effects, like what are some of the signs? Is it going to be very similar to the stress ones we were talking about, where it's like stomach issues and so forth? Or what are we talking about to where we're differentiating between trauma and stress? Or is there so much overlap you really don't differentiate? Like, I guess how I'm trying to get to is, so to the listener right now who's in law enforcement, who's maybe sitting in their patrol car as we talk, and they're like, I'm going out to these scenes and stuff, and there's all this talk about PTS, and there's all these talk about all these different things, and yet they're like, at the same time, I'm fighting with my wife at home. So
right.
let's talk to that guy or that gal who's listening right now. What are some of those things to, first of all, recognize, but what can we be doing from day one of the academy that keeps us from getting to the point to kind of like what I alluded to earlier, where the dam breaks? And I know that's a lot. Like I just gave, you can do a 6-hour lecture or a 5-minute answer. It's your call, John.
No pressure, John, but can you answer that in a sentence or two, please? Well, first, I would say it's in common with stress, or as a way to make someone resilient to stress or trauma, which is the basics of self-care. That if people are trying to balance their, exercise, and people hear this all the time, but I can't emphasize it enough. Getting a good amount of exercise. The CDC guidelines are that we should be getting 150 minutes of moderate exercise per week and at least 2 days of strength training per week. That's the minimum that we're supposed to get. I'm curious. I don't know if I've not seen any surveys like how many Americans are actually getting that, because I think that's a very small percentage. But that's the minimum that we're supposed to be. So making sure you're doing that for yourself and seeing that, I encourage people to see that as taking their medicine. Like, see that as medicine that's good for you, right? And that's needed. It's not optional, it's essential. So exercise, sleeping on average 8 hours, and making sure you have good nutrition, which I won't go down this pathway very far, but we talked earlier about caffeine, and so many people overuse caffeine, and then they find themselves jacked up, so then they need to use alcohol to wind down in the evening. And then they end up using more alcohol, which means they're more sedated in the morning, they use more caffeine. So that's all part of nutrition. So you got to be physiologically balanced and as much as possible kind of psychologically balanced. So that's the foundation. There's if people are able to have that foundation and can approach their work with kind of resilience skills, which, just to say for a minute, that sometimes people go through traumatic incidents and they actually come out with the positive effect. It's something called post-traumatic growth,
Hmm.
which is positive results that come from going through a traumatic incident. And some of those positive effects can be things like a greater appreciation for life, a deeper connection in relationships, and again, appreciation for relationships, um, an increase in spirituality,
Yeah.
and a deepened sense of personal meaning in life. And that may or may not translate into religiosity and going to church or temple or whatever, but certainly an increase in spirituality. And I believe that that's something that people can cultivate in their lives, are the focusing on some of those things, which then can potentially serve as a buffer about the traumatic events that they will encounter. Because not everybody who goes through a traumatic event will develop post-traumatic stress disorder. It's only a small percentage.
Okay.
Unfortunately, a larger percentage of law enforcement, I think my statistics are correct, and you may know more about this than I do, but I think the last time I saw something like 40% of people who are practicing law enforcement, who are kind of officers on duty, have post-traumatic stress disorder.
I've heard similar statistics, yes.
Yeah,
In fact,
right.
that's kind of one of the things that that's part of why I'm asking this question. Because I think
Yeah,
sometimes I think there's this thought, and I know speaking personally, that you kind of have, well, it's just being a cop. It's just being a cop. So, yes, I, maybe bit my wife's head off, or I yelled at the kids, or I kicked the dog, or, whatever. I didn't really kick a
yeah.
dog, but
Right.
just to
Yeah,
be clear.
right,
But,
right.
whatever it is that goes on, then I can just see where someone internalizes that, and they're like, well, it's just a cop. And then it kind of falls into the cycle that you described with the caffeine. And then, they end up on third shift or whatever. So now they're drinking caffeine most of the day. And then it's a
Yep.
day off.
Yeah.
So now it's alcohol most of the day, and this vicious cycle that just gets started. And I think that's kind of what I'm trying to also get to is, so we have this self-care
Mhm.
baseline, or the foundation, which I like how you put that. And on the foundation, I think it's important to note, as you said earlier, do something, like do the best, because I can already hear the kickback on, well, I'm not going to get 8 hours sleep. So, okay, I'm done here. I can hear that answer already.
Remember, get what you can, people. Maybe not 8 hours, but get what you can. Okay.
Exactly. So then to that end, like you said, with rates as high as, let's say, 40%, like at what point do they need to be going in? Should we be reaching out to talk to somebody, or is it all within that self-care realm, or what kind does that look like from a practical level?
Well, I think perhaps it's first if people can identify that they are impacted by trauma. I would imagine, and this is certainly true in law enforcement work from what I know and having worked with a lot of cops over the years, but also in other lines of work, a lot of people who like work in ERs, or people who are first responders, the first responders aside from police, that they just become accustomed to like dead bodies, or it's all these horrible injuries, and it's like they kind of end up like shrugging it off. It's, oh, that's just kind of part of the job, when they fail to recognize the impact that's having.
Yes.
And I think the most important thing is to recognize that trauma and PTSD is not simply something reserved for people coming back from a deployment. That people who are doing their job, and many people who just kind of in growing up in a difficult environment where they encountered a lot of emotional or physical abuse, or maybe even sexual abuse, not understanding that the impact of that can be trauma. So I think there's a lot of power in at least identifying, oh, like I'm a trauma survivor
Yeah.
and I'm impacted by this. And I think a lot of people assume or struggle with the fact that if they say that or they recognize that, well, that's automatically identifying weakness, and that's not something they want to be associated with, or that's not something they want to talk about.
Especially in these
Um,
communities.
Correct, especially in the law enforcement community. So, um, if a department can actually create an environment where people still feel safe going to certain, colleagues maybe who can be peer support for things like that, or people know where is the confidential resource through an employee assistance program, or can people maybe go to their doctor and get a referral kind of confidentially to someone in the mental health field
Yeah.
who has expertise and uh, who can be of help to them in regard to working on trauma and its impact.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful. I really think I like how you said it, because there's just so much information here, but really it boils down to taking action for the individual, being cognizant enough to recognize that, hey, I'm in a career, I'm around these things are happening, and then being willing to just kind of reach out and to start with some of these foundational things, as well as then being willing to reach out. And just for the listeners, I will be sure to put some things in the show notes as well, because there are some that we've had on the show before who they can always reach to across the country as well. Yes. Well, John, we're kind of boiling down on time a little bit here. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask you my question I ask everyone who comes on the show.
Okay.
What is the one takeaway, the one thing that we as law enforcement officers can do that's going to make a difference in our personal lives?
Wow, one thing. Ooh.
Well, you have so much good stuff here. I got to leave them with one, or they're going to be all over the map.
Right. So I would boil it down to this. Make sure that you have regular appointments. And when I'm saying regular, like at least just once a year with your primary care doctor, in which you get a realistic assessment of your health. Because people in law enforcement, and I'm talking probably more often men, but also women too, but more often men historically do not go to the doctor, because that's, I don't need a physician. And that what ends up happening is men don't go to the doctor until they get into their 40s, when all of a sudden they have a health crisis that causes them some sort of major setback, or maybe they die young. So we could wrap all of this around the idea that if you have a primary care doctor with whom you have a good working relationship, and you're doing regular checkups, that's going to help you do a realistic evaluation of your stress level, of your coping, and how you can be different in terms of the way you're approaching it.
John, I think that is great advice. And honestly, I have not had a guest since 2019 that's even come close to that idea. And I think that is fundamental, because you are absolutely right. I've seen it around people in my circle and so forth, that they just put these things off. And then sadly, all these things accumulate. And yes, probably is why the life expectancy for law enforcement is substantially lower than the general population.
Absolutely. Yeah.
John, I appreciate it. What is the best? You are a fountain of information. I'm hoping you're going to be able to come on again, because there's a million different directions I want to go. But for now, what is the best way that people can connect with you? Other than, obviously, we have activatesuccess.org. Any social media or anything like that where anyone can get with you?
Yes, you can find me on LinkedIn. John O'Brien on LinkedIn. If you just do a search, and it will come up under Activate Success. That's where I'm really focusing my social media presence right now. I've not been tweeting a lot yet. I'm sort of not, or Instagram or any of those other things. So my sweet spot really right now is through the work I'm doing on coaching and professional speaking through my website, and then stuff that I'm posting and writing on LinkedIn. So I've got a blog if people are curious on Activate Success, as well as stuff that I post on LinkedIn.
Very good. I will have all those linked up. John, thank you so much for coming on.
Listen, thanks so much for having me, Wayne. I'd be happy to come on again, and it was an enjoyable conversation.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to it. All right. How was that? I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Remember, every episode is available in video at Rumble and YouTube. I do prefer you go to Rumble because there will be a day that me and YouTube will part ways. But for now, they are one of the largest ones out there. However, our last episode got throttled because they didn't like the fact we were talking about law enforcement topics. So anyway, me and YouTube are on a very short partnership, if you would, for lack of a better term. But definitely check us out on Rumble, but for the time being, it's also available on YouTube. Every episode has the full show notes with the links to everything we discuss at ontheblueline.com/show notes. Or, as always, if you just go down to the notes below whatever platform you're watching this on, all of those links are there and we'll take you right to the website and right to the show notes page. Thank you all. Thank you so much for listening and continuing to watch and for telling others about what I'm trying to build here. I will see you next Monday in Morning Roll Call. I'm going to see you Thursday in the interview room, but in the meantime, I'm going to see you out there on the Blue Line.